Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Sebastián Rodriguez. I'm a journalist with Climate Home News. Thank you again to all the panelists. We have a very special event today. So thank you again. We are titling this event Transition Away from Fossil Fuels in an Unstable World. How can Santa Marta deliver? And Climate Home is hosting this space in partnership with the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. So thank you. Thanks for that partnership as well. We are here to set the scene before the first conference on transitioning away from fossil fuels, which is scheduled to take place in Colombia, in the Caribbean city of Santa Marta. And that will be happening from April 24 to the 29th in about 2 weeks. So this summit will host national governments, cities, civil society, indigenous people, academia, trade unions, lots of different sectors who are seeking to make progress on the transition away from fossil fuels. And so far, over 45 countries plus the EU have confirmed their attendance. Climate Home News will be there covering the event and bringing you all the most relevant information. But the conference builds on a push from last year at COP 30 in Belém. And for those who maybe are not that familiar with the topic, let me do a quick recap on what happened at the last summit, where a group of over 80 countries supported a discussion around an orderly and equitable transition away from fossil fuels. While this did not end up in the final outcomes of the COP, a group of first-moving countries, including hosts Colombia and the Netherlands, decided to create this space where debates around the transition can happen, and we can start having these more granular debates around what needs to happen for an equitable and orderly transition away from fossil fuels. Now, as we approach the conference, things have obviously changed in an unexpected way in the global scene, where the world is now experiencing the worst energy shocks in recent history due to the conflict in the Middle East. And to discuss how that will impact debates in Santa Marta and how the conference can create momentum towards a low carbon future, I'm joined by a very special panel today, we'll hopefully be having very fruitful discussions. With me is Daniela Duran, Head of International Affairs at the Ministry of Environment of Colombia, Cedric Zelu, Technical Director of the Office of the Minister for Climate Change and Sustainability in Ghana, and Sephora Berman, Chair and Founder of the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. With us will be, as well in a moment, Dr. Mainat Wakafu Atalia, Minister of Home Affairs, Climate Change and Environment of Tuvalu. And we can start the discussions. I hope everyone who is watching can also leave your comments in the different platforms where we are streaming this event. And we will have a short space at the end for your questions, so please make sure to drop them in the comment section. We will start with a video statement sent by Minister Irene Vélez, Environment Minister of Colombia, who had to attend an urgent matter and couldn't join us today for the event. But she still sent a video statement on how the current oil and gas crisis in the Middle East will impact discussions happening in Santa Marta later this month. So please, let's watch the video statement from Minister Vélez.
By more than 50 countries, which means that this space is having a global attention. And let me start by sharing with you what are the advancements in terms of organizing the first international conference on the transition away from fossil fuels. We have received the confirmation by more than 50 countries, which means that this space is having a global attention. And part of the reason why is, first of all, because there has been an accumulated crisis in the multilateral spaces in which green agendas and a climate crisis has been discussed. Particularly, the COP 30 showed a breaking point in relation to a group of countries trying to push into the agenda the discussion on the elimination of fossil fuels as part of the structural actions that are needed in a coordinated level at a global scale. And besides the fact that the countries were really pushing for the elimination to be part of the discussions, the general consensus was that it was not possible. Of course, we know that these multilateral spaces are in general very debatable, also because there is a lot of lobby by the oil industries, and many countries are oil producers themselves. So basically, there is like a natural blockade of those themes in the multilateral agendas. So that's one of the arguments why it is calling for so much attention. But the second one, which I think is crucial, is that we are having a global crisis generated by the conflict in the Middle East. And that conflict is showing us that we cannot be dependent on fossil fuels anymore. Gas is being very expensive. That's also generating an impact in the prices of fertilizers, which also impacts the prices of food at a global scale. And in addition, of course, we are seeing the shortage of oil, particularly affecting some areas of the globe, such as Europe. So in the context of this crisis, we are seeing it as something very relevant to be discussing about sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and what are the roots for energy sovereignty. So that's why, as part of our conference, we are addressing three main lines or objectives, themes that are relevant in the transitioning away of fossil fuels. The first one is how can we be less economically dependent on the production of fossil fuels? That is a subject that is particularly relevant for countries like Colombia that are economically dependent on a very intensive, CO2 intensive commodities, coal and oil in our case, but in some other cases, it can also be gas. So the first theme is how to be less economically dependent. The second one is how to make a rebalance of the energy matrix. So how do we deal with supply and how deal with consumption in a cleaner manner, in a way in which we can guarantee an organized elimination of fossil fuels. And the third theme is about multilateralism and how do we create new cooperation for a climate agenda, for a fossil fuels elimination agenda. We are going to be receiving all these ministers and high-level officials from 50 countries between the 28th and the 29th of April in Santa Marta, Colombia. But at the same time, we are also hosting a super relevant academic debate in which academics from all over the globe are declaring and constituting a panel to support, from a scientific perspective, the elimination of fossil fuels. So this is going to be an advisory group created by the scientific community to be able to support policymaking and decision-making by countries like Colombia that are deciding to eliminate fossil fuels. We are also having a People's Summit in which we are inviting NGOs, youth, women, indigenous communities, Afro-descendant communities, peasants, for all of them to come together to discuss and also to bring their own agendas and their own inputs in how to address the organized elimination of fossil fuels. So we are going to have this multi-stakeholder dialogue, and we are expecting and welcoming all of you to come to Colombia and to have this very important debate in a crucial moment at a global scale.
Thank you to Minister Vélez and her team for sending this statement. Certainly, we'll be discussing a lot of these topics in today's discussion. So To set the scene, I will maybe start with Daniela Duran, who's head of international affairs at the Colombian Ministry of Environment. Hi, Daniela. Thank you for joining us today. Maybe, to set the scene on the conference and its relevance, especially in this moment of energy crisis. Could you maybe tell us what are your expectations and how do you hope this process can develop into something that can maybe influence global transition away from fossil fuels?
Thank you very much, Sebastian, and a very warm hello to my colleagues from Ghana and to Minister Maina and to Sephora. And thank you very much for inviting us to this conversation. I'm walking between meetings, so apologies if the sound is a bit rough for this session. As Minister Vélez already mentioned, the Santa Marta conference borns as a response to a lack of a space where we can actually start talking and coordinating among ourselves on how are we going to implement the transitioning away from fossil fuels. Right now, despite decades of negotiations and despite different agreements that we already have, like the paragraph 28 of the first global stocktake that was agreed at COP28, we are still seeing a very, very huge barrier in the context of the UNFCCC for countries to work together towards a viable, equitable, and just implementation of the transition. And science cannot wait anymore, and the urgency of the climate crisis cannot wait anymore. And there is also a lot of appetite from different countries to work together to implement that transition in a way that it's possible and equitable for everyone. So the Santa Marta conference was born as a space precisely for those who are ready to move forward, to come together, to discuss particularly what are the enabling pathways for the transition in the three thematic pillars that the minister already very accurately highlighted, so we can start walking that path together. So Santa Marta, it's about implementation, it's about solutions, it's about enabling pathways for overcoming economic dependence, for transforming supply and demand, and for enhancing international cooperation and climate diplomacy. And we are very much aware that in 5 days in Santa Marta, we won't be able to solve all of the discussions and all of the issues around the implementation of the fossil fuel transition. So that is why we are thinking of Santa Marta as a first step in a process that we aim is complementary to the UNFCCC, a platform of implementation in which the countries that are here seated at the table, that are at this stage more than 50 countries that represent 1/3 of global demand of fossil fuels and 1/5 on global production of fossil fuels, can come together to maximize their collective and coordinated action to actually generate an impact in the implementation of the transition that actually allows the world to move forward to the response to this crisis, the environmental crisis, the human rights crisis, the climate crisis, but also to the economic instability that we are seeing that the dependency on fossil fuels is generating, both in producing countries, but also in consumer countries. So Santa Marta is seen as the first step of a legacy, and we are seeing three outcomes of Santa Marta that we want to highlight. The first one is a report. So the co-host will be working on a report that will bring together a menu of solutions for implementing the transition in the three thematic pillars. And this is something very important. We know that we're not starting from scratch. There is a lot of work out there already in science, in different initiatives, in civil society, in peoples, in countries themselves that are already advancing this transition, that we hope to surface, to connect, for initiatives to talk to each other. That is why this is a process that is for countries. Yes, we will meet in the high-level segment on the 28th and the 29th, but we have put a great effort in involving all civil society sectors. We received more than 600 submissions from all sectors for civil society, private sector, MPPs, NGOs, indigenous peoples, represented peoples, peasants, women, youth. We also have are in the process of having online dialogues with every sector that will nurture that report. And we hope the high-level segment in Santa Marta, which is going to be back-to-back with dialogues dedicated for each sector, it's the cherry on top of the pie for having a very good overview of solutions to implement the transition. The second result is the sense of process. So we are hoping Santa Marta to create a platform for implementation that does not die in Santa Marta as just another space in which we meet again to talk, but that is the first step for an implementation process in which a coalition can coordinate and maximize their collective power to generate an impact in the transition. And we are very much looking forward for a second conference to happen in 2027. We're working with partners for this to make that happen, in which we start focusing on materializing those cooperation actions that will maximize our collective power. And the third outcome that we are seeing here is a process that is supported by best available science, of course. We are also seeing how science is being questioned, so we hope this process and this coalition of those who are ready to move forward to an implementation stage can be informed by best available science. That is why we're working with different academics that will be launching a panel on energy transition for that panel to connect with specific recommendations on the process that we are having here. So just to wrap up this intervention, we are seeing Santa Marta as a dedicated platform for implementation. So we go from the do we need to transition, because we already know that we need to transition, towards the how are we going to make that possible for everyone and in an equitable way that allows us to overcome the different structural inequalities that are around this process. In Santa Marta, it's the first step of a very successful coalition, cooperation, and process that can maximize our collective power to generate an impact on the urgency of the climate crisis in human rights, and that allows us to start working together to make this happen. So thank you very much for the intervention, and very much looking forward to hear my colleagues.
Thank you, Daniela. And
Well.
before allowing you to return to your desk, I did want to ask a quick follow-up question on just the level of interest that you've received. You mentioned 600 submissions for the report. I don't know if you might want to comment on that as well. And I think we've lost her. She might have been walking back to her office. I'll follow now with Minister Mai Natalia. Thank you for joining us all the way from Tuvalu for today's event. Minister Talia, we would like perhaps to start by asking you on this on the current moment in global geopolitics. And we know the small island states have been championing the idea of a transition away from fossil fuels for some time. And last year in Belém, we saw a group of over 80 countries, including oil and gas producers, rallying behind this idea. Now, with the current oil and gas crisis, do you see a window of opportunity for making progress on this debate? How would you maybe analyze the current situation?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for the opportunity, and a very good morning from this side of the world. I'm glad that I'm able to join this call, which I believe is very important prior to our meeting next week in Vanuatu for our preparation meeting for Santa Marta as the Pacific comes together. For decades, small island states like Tuvalu and the rest of the Pacific have fought not just for a target, but for the integrity of our homes and the future of our children. We were the ones who pushed for the 1.5 in the Paris Agreement. We were the ones who brought the world's attention to the need for a treaty to govern fossil fuels. And we took our case for climate justice to the International Court of Justice. The court's recent opinion affirmed what we have always known, that continuing fossil fuel expansion is not just irresponsible, it violates the international law and rights of our people to life. Now, this global energy crisis that we are facing today, with its price shocks and geopolitical instability, painfully proves our point on a devastating scale. It shows the world that we are having a long experience, that fossil fuel dependence is a trap. For us, this means more budgets going to fuel imports instead of healthcare, and greater insecurity for our communities already facing the cruel reality of rising seas. So, yes, this crisis is brutal, but clear window. It reveals that the fatal flaws of the old system to everyone. It creates a moment where the moral leadership of the most vulnerable can align with the growing energy security concern of others. For years, our urgent demand is consensus-based. Forum have been vetoed by diluted by wealthy nations and interests they protect. Initiatives like Santa Marta's are different. This is a space conceived and led by the nations most impacted. Here we are not discussing from back of the room. We are setting the agenda at the head of the table. And we are moving past the blockers to build a practical cooperation we desperately need. We have no more time for the abstract debates that end only in words. In Tuvalu, we are implementing adaptation plans today because the ocean is at our door. We are already engineering our coastlines and relocating communities further inland, those who live on the coastlines. This conference in Santa Marta focuses on the tangible, designing the financial mechanism that can actually reach out to our shores, securing the technology transfer that doesn't come with debts, and building the economic pathways that allow the nation to choose its people over oil reserves. This is where diplomacy finally connects to the ground. It stopped being about positions that starts with about implementing. The lifelines of our communities are waiting for us. So we look forward for the Santa Marta meeting because I think we have tried the UNFCCC process for how many COPs now? 31 COPs. It still fails us. So the Santa Marta's meeting on phasing out a fossil fuel, it brings a lot of hope for countries that are highly impacted by global warming. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Maina. I did want to maybe bring a question from the chat quickly for you, maybe as a follow-up. I don't know if you're able to hear us. We received a question from Lucas Parlin on LinkedIn, who said, this conference is meant to be a coalition of the willing, but when will this conversation shift to changing the minds of the unwilling? I don't know if you want to also maybe comment on that as a quick follow-up.
No, thank you. I think the crisis, the oil crisis right now, it really shows that we don't need to convince the unwilling. The crisis itself have felt its impact across the globe, especially this side of the world that totally depends on oil for fuel. So we don't need to convince the unwilling. It's a matter of common sense, because right now the whole world is currently impacted by the fuel crisis. So the Santa Marta we are in a very good position, given the oil, the fuel crisis that we have to deal with.
Thank you, Minister. I'll turn now to Cedric, who's joining us today from the Ministry of Climate Change and Sustainability in Ghana. Cedric, you come from a country, much like Colombia is in the global south and is leading on this debate, but it's also a fossil fuel producer. So could you maybe comment on the role of fossil fuel producing nations and how it differs from the role of developed nations in many ways? Yes, I'll pass it on to you, Cedric.
Thank you very much, Sebastian, for the opportunity. And truly speaking, I consider it a privilege to share this platform with the Honorable Minister, as well as very distinguished personalities who have taken time from far and near to join us ahead of our meeting in Santa Marta, somewhere in 2 weeks to come. It is true that developing countries like Ghana and Colombia, have a very critical and increasingly influential role to play in shaping the global transition away from fossil fuel. However, this role must be understood within the context of equity, development needs, and historical responsibility. I'm speaking at a time that developing countries are demonstrating leadership, by actively participating in different global engagement and forum. Just last, 3 weeks, the Minister of State for Climate Change and Sustainability in Ghana, led national convening on the fossil fuel treaty, of which I believe that most people, on this panel are aware. Pursuing a balanced, pathway, to leverage our natural resources while scaling up renewable energy. And most of the discussions that are coming from these such convenings and around developing countries is evidence of the fact that developing countries are enhancing climate resilience. We are promoting the implementation of our nationally determined contributions. But it is important that we appreciate that the expectations of developing countries cannot be mirrored to that of developed countries. We cannot see Ghana the same way we see Germany or US. We can't see Colombia as we see, France. Why? Because we do know already, but let me just, go through that developed countries have contributed hugely to, the greenhouse gas emission. We also do know that through this benefit, they build the economies, huge economies, from fossil fuel. We also do know that they have greater financial and technological capacity to deal with any shocks. Look, let me tell you, even in the wake of this war, when countries like Ghana are talking about having 7 weeks of oil reserves, countries like America are talking about having what, 100 years of oil reserves. We're talking about capacity, Sebastian. We're talking about the financial architecture. But then this role must lead, the role of developed countries must lead into deep, rapid emission reductions. It must also lead, to ensure that there's predictable climate financing. We can't have a system where finances from the global west, has a shortfall and is unpredictable and even not accessible. We also need to have developed countries lead the way to support technological transfer. I make this point every day that I have traveled to 42 countries in this world. I've spoken to almost every global platform that could be. I've spoken in New York, to Glasgow, to Germany, France. I've addressed presidents and ministers. But in all of these, I cannot even put a solar panel on my roof. Why? Because the cost of solar panel is outrageous. We're talking about $40,000, $30,000, an amount that even my entire year salary cannot even reach. But this is Sir Cedric, who has traveled to 42 countries, who has spoken on climate change, who has addressed global leaders on, fossil fuel and then solar energy. Yet, right here, I cannot afford what e-vehicle. I cannot afford, a solar panel on my roof because of the technological transfer, the cost of this capacity. And here we look to the West. If we say that solar is best, if we say electric is best, that must be able to translate to the cost of it. We cannot have it higher than even the fossil fuel inventions. Let me now turn attention to the developing countries like Ghana. We need to ensure that our pursuit of a just, inclusive transition does not compromise our development goals. Today, if we ask developed countries like Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, and other countries to move strictly away from fossil fuel in a manner that is not just, I can tell you that within months, their economies will collapse. That is why people like us who are advising ministers are saying that the transition must be just. The transition must be inclusive. You are telling a woman who has no financial income to stop using firewood These are people who cannot even afford, any other means of energy. The basic is what they have. Our concern is also to ensure that we don't lock out, don't lock out in terms of the carbon market system, which is coming across. We want to act as co-creators of solution. That developing countries don't just want to be the implementers of external design frameworks. Every time, Sebastian, it is a shame that the frameworks, strategies, technologies are being designed in the global north. And what do we see? We see that they're just handed over to the global south, in most cases without the influence and participation of the global south. So this principle of common but differentiated responsibility must remain central. And before I pause and then you move to the second question, I want to quickly address the comment that the minister made that, for those who don't want to, come along, non-alliance, or those who are not non-willing, yes, the non-willing, he put it that we should ignore the non-willing. He put it that we can move on without necessarily bringing on the non-willing. I think that I would want to put out, a different approach. We need to be concerned about the willing. One of the critical principles of climate change and just transition is leave no one behind. The leave no one behind principle is not just about not leaving those who are vulnerable behind. It is also about not leaving those who have the capacity behind. Because today, the Strait of Hormuz, the war in Iran has demonstrated to us the real question of moving away from fossil fuel. I want you, Sebastian, to appreciate that when the war broke out in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz was closed, no one was talking about solar energy. No one was talking about wind energy. No one was talking about any form of clean energy. All global leaders were talking about oil, fossil fuel. What does it mean? It means that once we drive towards the optimal approach of having clean energy, we cannot be blind to the realities of our current existence. That no matter what to do, fossil fuel is the anchor of almost every democracy in this world. And that even we're talking about just Strait of Hormuz being closed down temporarily. So imagine that other straits to say, or other openings, other channels are being closed. Sebastian, I can tell you that you and I will not be on this call to be talking to each other because it will affect us in different form. So we don't need to leave these people behind. We need to let them appreciate that we recognize the fact that most economies rely on fossil fuel. However, we want to transition in a manner that is fair, in a manner that is just. Today, when you go to America, Americans are saying that before the war in Iran, fuel was $2.4. Today, they are crying that fuel gallon is now $4.16. I dare tell you that there's no American who is not complaining, saying that, well, a gallon is now 4.16. However, I'm going to buy it because I support, moving away from fossil fuel. That argument is not there. And I appreciate that this conversation is a debate. That as we speak, the people in Iran, the people around, the Iran, the Persian Gulf, Europe, the cry we hear today are cries about the increase of fossil fuel even to the global south. Not even the advocates are able to voice out to say that let us take this opportunity to now push the agenda of solar energy, to now push the agenda of wind energy. No. That debate has gone down. That concern has gone down. Why? Because of the central role of fossil fuel. So I speak to you at a time that the minister has instructed me that, Cedric, let the forum be mindful of the fact that we support a just and equitable transition away from fossil fuel. But we cannot be blind to the realities. It is for that reason we must bring everybody along. It is for that reason we must ensure that we invite everyone to the table and move on in a manner that is inclusive, and participatory, as well as consultative. Not to see those who are against the process as enemies of the agenda or as people who do not aspire for good, but to understand that it is a process. I'll pause here for now, Sebastian.
Thank you, Cedric. In the interest of time, I'll turn to Sephora, who is the founder of the Fossil Fuel Treaty Initiative. Sephora, thanks for joining. The organizers of the summit, and well, Daniela briefly mentioned it, the conference in Santa Marta is meant to be complementary to discussions in other diplomatic summits, such as COPs. So what are examples of areas or debates that you consider essential that should happen or belong in Santa Marta that are not happening really in any other diplomatic summits? Could you maybe comment on this?
I can. Thank you, Sebastian, and to Climate Home and Honorable Minister. It's an honor to share this platform with you and these other government leaders. They set a very clear stage for our conversation, and Daniela really set the bar with how articulate she was while walking down the street. So I'll see what I can do. Look, the UN framework on climate change. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change plays a really vital role in climate governance, and it will continue to do so. However, as Minister Mena spoke to, it's a consensus-based process, and that process has become deadlocked on the core issue of fossil fuels. So year after year, we've seen this deadlock exploited to delay meaningful action on fossil fuel supply. And so for over 30 years, the UN climate process has been unable to address the core driver of the crisis, fossil fuel production. So countries set emissions reduction targets. They have a significant market effect, and they've really stimulated the growth in renewable energy development and electrification. But countries have argued about even whether to include the words fossil fuel phase out in the text. And what we're seeing is emission reduction targets being set while growing production. That's absurd. What we build today will be what we use tomorrow. And of course, right now we're on track to produce 120% more oil, gas, and coal by 2030 than can ever be burned if we want to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So you can't phase out fossil fuels while expanding fossil fuel production and infrastructure. So Santa Marta is the first time governments who are willing to have the right conversation are convening to chart pathways forward, not to debate whether to phase out fossil fuels, but to talk about how. So there are two critical gaps that I think are going to be addressed in Santa Marta that we've seen in the processes so far. The first is clearly a governance gap. So what I mean by that is, despite the science and the landmark agreement by the International Court of Justice advisory opinion, there is still no international law that creates a binding obligation to stop fossil fuel expansion and manage a fair phase out. So this is a legal void that perpetuates the crisis, and the need to fill this gap should be at the center of any diplomatic agenda, and I think will be in Santa Marta. And then I would say the second implementation gap is really the equity gap that we've heard so articulately about from Cedric. We can't ask countries to forego oil revenues if the alternative is economic collapse. The real barriers are structural. It's crushing sovereign debt. It's no access to affordable transition finance and legacy investment treaties that are penalizing climate action. Other forums that we have talk about support in the abstract, and Santa Marta, I think, is about designing this specific binding architecture, like a global just transition fund, like debt resolution mechanisms that would actually enable countries to implement a phase out without self-sacrifice. And so I think while it's critical that countries create national phase-out plans and the national regulations to ensure those phase-out plans, to include those in their NDCs in the UNFCCC process, that's not enough. Many countries in the Global South that just simply can't do that without further international cooperation that addresses these systemic barriers to fossil fuel phase-out. So I think we're going to start having those critical conversations now, in Santa Marta and beyond at the second conference. And that will start to create new agreements between nation states that can start to create new infrastructure to make plans for timelines for phase out.
Thanks, Sephora. And as a follow-up question, since you mentioned the ideas for a global fossil fuel transition fund, I was wondering whether the wide range of debates and ideas that happen in Santa Marta, would those need to eventually move to any of these other diplomatic summits? Say, would a COP agreement be necessary for setting up a transition fund, or what are the alternatives to
If you look in history at other major diplomatic conferences, were born out of similar tensions where issues just couldn't move inside the existing processes. So new processes had to be created. So there is no question that some new processes will be created out of Santa Marta, and that some of the ideas will go back and live and increase climate ambition and live within the existing frameworks. And how that all plays out in Santa Marta and beyond remains to be seen. What we're working on, though, with 18 nation states who will continue to develop these ideas in the third track of the conference that Daniela articulated on international cooperation, is a fossil fuel treaty. It's a global South-led proposal born from the countries most exposed to the consequences of fossil fuel development and climate change, and designed to meet their needs. So the framework of the treaty is designed to solve those two fundamental gaps in governance. So it would create legally binding obligations to end expansion, and it would build equity infrastructure so the phase out could happen, like mechanisms for a global just transition. It offers a concrete pathway for participating nations, and that group is growing and will grow this year. It offers them a seat at the table to actually sit down with other countries who really want to do it and create the rules and design these rules of a global just transition. So not just the two I've mentioned, but we're looking at many other debt relief mechanisms. We're looking at legal protections from fossil fuel industry-led litigations, and members of the coalition kind of working together on equity and economic development. It will do things differently. And in fact, the Santa Marta conference itself originated from that table, from conversations among the 18 countries engaged in the treaty initiative at a meeting of our participating nations in 2024, December 2024. Those countries agreed to launch a series of diplomatic conferences outside the UN space to create a shared pathway. And then in June 2025, Colombia offered to host the first one. And this model does have a proven track record. So if you look at the Ottawa Convention, where focused conferences have united willing states and broken deadlocks to pave the way for binding agreements like the Landmine Treaty. So in that case, to your question, those conversations created a pathway, and that treaty that was eventually created was then brought back inside the UN system. So since COP30 in Belém, the ownership of the Santa Marta conference has shifted with the announcement of the Netherlands as co-host, and obviously backed by the dozens of countries who signed the Belém Declaration. So the purpose and scope has expanded, and so the fossil fuel treaty is one of the I think key mechanisms that will be discussed under the third track, but there are many other outcomes, and where those outcomes live, how they eventually relate to the Brazil roadmap process, how they eventually relate to the UNFCCC process remains to be seen. But there's good cooperation and dialogue, and I think at this moment in history, it's okay that we have at least three processes and entities that are starting to have serious conversations on fossil fuel phase out.
Thank you, Sephora. I'll now move to the section where we'll take questions from the audience. So if you're watching and want to ask any of our speakers a question, please drop that in the chat on LinkedIn or any other platforms. For the questions, we'll have to excuse Minister Maina, who had to leave to board the plane, but we'll we'll hear plenty of him at the Santa Marta conference. I'll now return to Daniela because a lot of the questions are logistical. Daniela, I hope you're seated now and could find a good place to respond to the questions. Many of them are asking about any options for virtual participation, and if you could comment as well on the level of participation in the conference of producer countries that are currently dependent on fossil fuels.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. And with regards of online participation, let me go a bit back into the participation process that we have set up. So there was a registration of interest form open until February 26th. That gives us the universe of interested organizations in engaging in the process. And we asked for written submissions afterwards, and right now we're in a stage in which we are holding virtual dialogues with each one of the stakeholder groups. We are having virtual dialogues with the private sector, with trade unions, with NGOs, with indigenous peoples, with peoples of African descent, with peasants, with women, with youth and diversities, with parliamentarians, with subnational governments. So those are happening right now. You will be able to attend to those if you registered your interest in the forms that was open for that purpose. In Santa Marta, we will have in-person dialogues for each one of those sectors. They will not have online participation. They will be in-person dialogues. We will have an in-person dialogue for the trade unions, an in-person dialogue for parliamentarians and subnational governments, an in-person dialogue for peoples that it's built in a funnel methodology. So we will have a big assembly of the members of the Climate Action Network, DCJ, and other networks. From that, there will be a committee that will be joining a people's assembly that will join the delegates from indigenous peoples, peoples of African descent, women's, youth, and diversity. And from that people's assembly, some spokespersons will be delegated to the high-level segment to present those discussions. There will be also a pre-people's assembly for all of those organizations that are not part of the Climate Action Network and DCJ space that will be able to join that pre-people's assembly to discuss the pillars, and that will have the same funnel methodology of having a committee of that pre-people's assembly that will join the people's assembly, and that then will end up in the spokespersons that will participate in the high-level segment. With regards to online transmission of the high-level segment, there will be some parts of some plenaries that will be transmitted and that will be webcasted. Breakout sessions will not be transmitted online. We are hoping to create an environment with participation from the different representatives of the stakeholders and with the ministers, but these sessions, we are aiming to have those very small in an informal format, because again, we do not want to repeat a format in which we just talk and do not reach to any concrete debate around how do we materialize and work together on this implementation. And that's the kind of environment that we would like to have in Santa Marta. So I hope that responds to the participation questions there. And with the level of representation, I was missing that part of the question. I did mention that in my intervention. We have 1/5 of global oil production and 1/3 of global oil demand. So we have both producing countries and consumer countries joining us in Santa Marta. We have now more than 50 countries that will be coming, a majority of them with representation that it's ministerial, vice-ministerial, or its equivalent, representatives from all of the regions. So I'm sure that we will have a very productive discussion on enabling pathways and solutions. I want to be very, very, very clear that we are not aiming to have a negotiated outcome out of this conference. We won't have it. This is a space for us to come together to discuss those enabling pathways and to figure it out how are we going to materialize that collective power that we have towards the second conference in a complementary way with other forums, but we're not having a negotiated outcome at this conference. So we are really happy that we're going to have a very fruitful discussion, very representative discussion from different regions, but also from the producer and consumer perspective as well.
Thanks, Daniela. I have you here. Nina Lacani from Drilled Media actually asks a question that I think makes sense for you. She asks what measures are being taken to restrict access to fossil fuel lobbyists and other nefarious interests in Santa Marta, which have captured multilateral spaces, including COP.
That's a very interesting question. We did have a process of scanning and analyzing all of the organizations that registered their interest to the Santa Marta conference. We had a set of criteria, a set of experts working with us, and those who will be joining us in Santa Marta are those that are aligned with the purposes and vision of the conference as well.
Thanks. Thanks, Daniela. I'll turn to Cedric because Sarah Schornhardt on LinkedIn asks if you could explain why solar panels are so expensive in Ghana. You mentioned that during your intervention, and perhaps you could explain why that has become a barrier for the transition into renewables.
Yes, solar panels are relatively expensive in Ghana because we told of the battery, because the battery system is that which actually save the energy that is being harnessed from the sun. And for some reason, what I have uncovered is that the pioneers in solar panel, or the investors, or the innovators, or the manufacturers see it to be purely business. So we are speaking at a time when we think that this is an innovation that should supplement or replace fossil fuel. But those who are leading the research, those who are leading the investment into solar panel and clean energy, do not just see it as providing clean energy, but they do see it as business, as investment that should bring in profit. If not, an electric vehicle will not cost $40,000, whilst a petrol or diesel, car costs $20,000 or $15,000. If not, solar panel will not be that expensive. And so it also comes to who is leading the charge. The Fossil Fuel Treaty, Non-Proliferation Treaty, is leading the charge in terms of providing this discourse, this platform, on just equitable transition. However, in that phase of transition, who are behind the companies manufacturing the solar panels, the electric vehicles? Who are the innovators providing the financial resources? So it could still be these same people who are in the fossil fuel industry making a case that, okay, well, no problem. If you want to move away from fossil fuel, we will provide you with solar panel. We will provide you with electric vehicle, with wind energy, but we also not going to make a loss out of it. That is where we are now, Sebastian.
Thanks, Cedric. I want to turn now to Sephora. There's a question on the chat saying, if a global just transition fund were to be set up, how would it be filled? We have a lot of climate funds already, and they are all chasing the same shrinking donor dollars. Is the idea to look more at solidarity levies or taxes on fossil fuels?
Thank you. It's a really good question. So we're working right now with a panel of finance experts, all from the Global South, who have been reviewing existing funds and what's working and what's not. I mean, and what we're finding is that in a lot of the existing funds, there's huge time lags, 4 to 6 years for money to actually flow. And in a lot of the funds, there are only loans, which increase the debt burden, not grants. So it's not just about where the money comes from, which is a critical question. It's also about how it actually works and who it's designed to work for. So we are addressing all of those questions. A number of the frameworks that were in your question are being looked at. We're also looking at some of the proposals that have been on the table about redirecting subsidies, some of the proposals that are on the table around sovereign wealth funds, especially from countries who have benefited from the fossil fuel era and who hold more of a historic responsibility. So there's a number of different proposals that are being made that will be under consideration with those countries who are at the table when negotiations begin. And that's why who's actually participating in the development of the fossil fuel treaty is really critical. There's 18 countries so far. There's more like Ghana who are in conversation and who have expressed interest in joining the table. And then once that begins, the countries will decide what mechanisms they want to include. And so we have put out a number of reports, which you can find on our website, that articulate the areas that we're looking at now. And there are more reports coming within the next 6 months, both on debt and on the Global Just Transition Fund.
Thank you. We have another question from Alice Martins on the chat who asks, it's addressed to all the speakers, so if you want to comment, feel free to do so. She asks, what are the implications of the possible absence of the United States and China from the conference in Santa Marta?
Maybe I can jump in answering the part of that question, but would very much love to hear the views of my fellow panelists on this as well. Santa Marta is a conference designed for those who are ready to move forward. And that's the principle that has gathered us together, because again, we do not want to enter into a discussion that we've been having in the UNFCCC and in several forums the past years, that it's not about how are we going to do this? How are we going to collectively overcome our economic dependence in a way that it's equitable for everyone, but on whether we need to do it or not. And that's precisely the conversation that we want to avoid here. So we do not want to bring up that noise. So in that sense, one of these two actors mentioned not being in Santa Marta, for us at this stage, it's something that will enable us to have the kind of conversations that we want to have around the how are we going to implement this transition and how are we going to materialize our collective power in there. And second, we believe that these discussions lead towards expanding this group over time. We are really hoping that the actions that we're taking here to materialize that international cooperation that needs to generate the right economic incentives for renewables to be affordable, as Cedric was mentioned, but also the right economic incentives to allow for the economic diversification of countries, to allow for overcoming the fiscal dependence of countries, will create incentives that hopefully over time can bring others to the table to engage in this discussion in these terms, on the how, not on whether if, but on the how.
If I could briefly add to that, if that's okay, Sebastian, I really appreciate both what the Colombian governments and the Netherlands and the Dutch government have done in their invitations to the conference and to whom, and to creating a group of countries that is, convening nations that are really committed to building a transition away from fossil fuels, not a debate, and those who are actively trying to undermine the goal. And let's be clear, the current US government has shown no intent to halt fossil fuel extraction and expand, and in fact is increasing expansion and actively pursuing that, deliberately hindering renewable energy development as part of its strategic position against China, and locking other nations into long-term dependency on fossil fuel exports. So this dependency creates a form of energy leverage and allowing the US to potentially restrict access in order to exert political and economic influence. So I think a conference that is convening nations who are really committed to building the transition away from fossil fuels is really important. And the absence of the US, I think, demonstrates the very purpose of the Santa Marta process. So a coalition of ambition among nations who are willing to lead, precisely so that no single country, no matter how large or powerful, can hold global progress hostage. And I think what we're seeing as a key goal of this conference is to forge solidarity, to create a kind of community of practice, and that strengthens a high ambition coalition. Countries who are committing to create cooperative frameworks and don't have to stand alone. And I think at this moment in history, that kind of plurilateral and multilateral cooperation on issues that are critical to energy security, to national security, to the and to all of our security. Like, let's not forget that this conference is also happening with a backdrop of one person is dying every minute due to lethal heat, where our children are literally gasping for breath because air pollution due to fossil fuels is the single largest cause now of premature death on the planet. 1 in 5 people are dying due to air pollution due to fossil fuels alone. And I think we shouldn't forget that history is made by those who show up. Santa Marta will be a historic moment. The moment when over 50 countries come together to have the conversation that the oil industry, one of the most profitable and powerful industries in the history of the earth, has been working to deny, delay, and diffuse for decades. So Santa Marta, and I would say the second conference that will be hosted by Tuvalu in the South Pacific, as well as the development of the fossil fuel treaty, offer an opportunity to do things differently. And when we look at other examples, again, throughout history, whether it's landmines or chemical weapons or nuclear weapons, a lot of the big players were not at the table. But those agreements, even if the big players never participated, they changed the game. And they shifted the social norm of what was acceptable in other foreign policy debates. And so social change isn't linear. And I think this conversation will have significant ramifications even beyond the specific outcomes in Santa Marta.
Thank you. Cedric, I don't know if you want to also add anything.
Yes, I like to look at the United States, in some kind of an intertwined framework. U.S. with Trump, U.S. without Trump. U.S. with Trump even has two ways to look at it. But clearly, as the chair Tibora put it, U.S. with Trump is evident that you have a situation where it is a no-go area. I mean, this topic cannot even reach anywhere to the doors of the White House. However, there is an example to point to that whilst Trump has almost all the laws related to climate change and environment, science and research, it is also evident that about 20 states in the US are coming together, forming alliances to address climate change at the state level. And so even US with Trump, it is still positive, it is still possible that we can still have a form of engagement from the US from the state level. We have heard Bloomberg, we have heard different governors saying that they are willing to step up to address the challenges of climate change, even if the federal level is not willing to do that. And so for someone like Tibora, the chair, and other leaders of fossil fuel, let us not totally ignore US because Trump is in the picture. Trump is in the big picture at a federal level, but we can begin to target those states, those agencies, those NGOs, like the Bloomberg philanthropies, like Chicago, like Atlanta, where they still believe in the science of climate change, where they still want to support this process. So we can extend some of these invitations to these conferences to them at the state level to contribute to the discussion, to contribute towards framing the narrative and having them as part of the convening of the willing. Now we move to the US without Trump. There's abundance of evidence that a US without Trump will restore some form of sanity to the space. A US without Trump as president will have most of these laws that have been repealed to be reenacted to say. A US without Trump will begin to position climate change at its better and workplace perspective. And there we could have a more federal conversation with the US. This is how I will look at it.
Thank you, Cedric. And thanks to all of our panelists and to everyone who tuned in. We'll have to wrap it up here. We've gone a little bit over the hour, but yeah, it shows the level of interest there is on these topics. So thank you all for bringing your comments, and thank you to everyone who joined our broadcast. Thank you.
Thank you very much.